Thrown out before winter, she built a Quonset shelter from scrap. It saved her northern Wyoming, October 1958. When Martha Harlan was forced off the ranch she'd worked for nearly 20 years, winter was already closing in. Snow dusted the foothills early that year, and nights dropped below freezing before most people finished stacking firewood. With nowhere else to go and no money for proper lumber, Martha gathered what she could find: scrap steel, warped timbers, discarded Quonset panels left behind from a decommissioned work camp. Neighbors said it wouldn't last a week. Scrap metal didn't insulate. Gaps would leak cold. And a woman alone building a shelter that late in the season was asking for trouble. Some told her to leave before the passes closed. Others said she wouldn't survive her first real storm. Martha didn't argue. She didn't have time. She wasn't trying to build a home that looked right. She was trying to build something that would hold together when the snow came down hard and didn't stop. And when winter finally arrived early and violent, that scrap-built Quonset shelter faced the only test that mattered. It saved her. If you want one real survival build each week, the kind proven only when things go wrong, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Northern Wyoming, October 1958. The foothills west of Dry Creek Junction had already taken on the dull gray look that meant winter was ahead of schedule. Frost clung to the grass at dawn, and thin snow lingered in the shadows long after the sun climbed. The kind of weather that didn't kill outright, but promised to if you ignored it. That was when Martha Harlan lost her place. She had worked the Red Bluff Ranch for nearly 20 years, cooked meals during calving season, mended fence when hands ran short, kept the books when the owner's health failed. It wasn't a job that came with security, but it came with a roof, and in Wyoming, that mattered more than most things. When the ranch changed hands in early October, the arrangement ended without ceremony. The new owner wanted family there, not hired help. Martha was given 2 weeks to clear out the small bunkhouse she'd been living in and take what she could carry. There were no hard feelings spoken. There didn't need to be. Winter was already coming. Most people assumed she would head into town, that she'd find a room, take work where she could, and wait out the season. That was the sensible choice. It was also impossible. Rooms cost money she didn't have. Jobs dried up once the cold set in. And the thought of leaving the only country she knew didn't sit right with her. So Martha did what she'd always done. She stayed. She packed her few belongings into a borrowed truck and drove north along the gravel road until the ranch buildings disappeared behind her. She stopped near a stand of cottonwoods beside Dry Creek, on land nobody had claimed or bothered with in years. It wasn't good ground, rocky, wind-scoured, but it was out of sight and it wasn't going to ask her to leave. That was all she needed. Word traveled fast in a place that small. By the time she started unloading her things, people already knew she was out there with no house and little time. Some stopped by to look. A few offered advice. "You can't build this late. Winter'll be here in weeks. You need real lumber." Others were less kind. "She's got no business trying to rough it alone. That scrap won't hold. She'll be gone by the first storm." Martha heard it all and kept working. She didn't have a plan in the way people expected. No drawings, no supply list. What she had was access. The old work camp up the valley had been abandoned years earlier. Quonset panels sat half buried in weeds. Steel ribs rusted where they'd been left. Lumber warped by sun and snow lay stacked where nobody wanted it. Scrap, everyone called it. Martha called it material. She spent her days hauling what she could manage alone. Curved metal sheets, bent steel ribs, short lengths of timber, nails pulled and straightened. Nothing matched. Nothing was new, but it was enough to work with. Neighbors shook their heads when they saw the pile grow. "That'll never keep you warm. You'll freeze before December." They weren't wrong about one thing. If she built like everyone else, she wouldn't last. Martha knew that too. She had spent winters on the ranch watching good buildings struggle. Square bunkhouses with thick walls still bled heat once the wind picked up. Fires burned nonstop and never caught up. People survived by tending stoves, not because the structures helped them. She didn't have the fuel or the strength for that kind of fight. What she had was urgency. By late October, the first real snow fell. Not much, just enough to harden the ground and remind everyone that time was running out. Martha worked through it, hands stiff with cold breath hanging white in the air. She didn't try to make the shelter look right. She tried to make it hold. The Quonset panels went up first, curved and low, forming a half-arch that faced away from the worst of the wind. The shape wasn't chosen for style. It was chosen because it didn't argue with the weather. Wind slid over it instead of slamming into it. The shelter grew day by day, awkward and uneven, but solid where it mattered. She left gaps where she needed air to move slowly. She overlapped steel where she could. She weighted the base with stone and earth to keep it from shifting. People stopped laughing, not because they believed it would work, but because they could see she wasn't leaving. By the time the nights dropped into the teens, the shelter stood complete enough to crawl into. A small stove sat inside, salvaged from the camp. The interior smelled of cold steel and damp earth, but it was enclosed, protected. Barely. Martha lay awake that first night listening to the wind scrape across the metal and wondered if she had waited too long. If one storm would undo everything. But she didn't pack up, because she had already been thrown out once. And she wasn't going to let winter finish the job without a fight. In northern Wyoming, winter didn't need a storm to be deadly. It only needed exposure and time. Martha Harlan understood that in a way people with houses often didn't. Cold by itself was manageable. A hard night could be endured. Even a rough week could be survived if there was something solid to retreat into. What killed people was being caught halfway, half sheltered, half prepared, with no margin left when conditions stopped giving second chances. Martha had lived long enough on ranches to see how quickly things went wrong once that margin disappeared. The bunkhouse at Red Bluff Ranch had been well built by local standards. Thick plank walls, a pitched roof that shed snow clean. A stove big enough to glow red on the coldest nights. And still, every winter followed the same pattern. Heat rose and vanished. Wind found seams no one had sealed. Fires burned hard just to hold the line. She remembered nights during calving season when the thermometer outside dipped below zero and stayed there. The bunkhouse never warmed past the low 40s, no matter how much wood they fed the stove. People slept in layers, boots close by, waking stiff and tired before the day even started. That was with shared labor, with steady fuel, with backup if something failed. Out by Dry Creek, Martha had none of that. She had no stacked cordwood, only what she could scavenge and cut herself. No one to take over if she got sick. No extra stove if the one she salvaged cracked or failed. Whatever she built had to work without constant attention, because she wouldn't always have the strength to keep feeding it through the night. That reality shaped every decision she made. She knew she couldn't win a straight fight against winter. Bigger fires weren't an option. More fuel wasn't coming. If her shelter leaked heat the way the bunkhouse had, she wouldn't last until January. The real threat wasn't freezing temperatures. It was heat loss. Wind was the worst of it. On the open foothills, it never stopped moving. Even on calm days, air slid downhill once the sun set, carrying warmth away like water down a gutter. Square walls gave the wind something to push against. Corners created suction. Flat surfaces lost heat faster simply because moving air stripped it away. Martha had watched that happen year after year. She'd seen men build thicker walls and burn more wood and still wake to frost inside. She'd watched people lose sleep not because they were cold at the moment, but because they were afraid of how fast things would change if they let the fire die. She couldn't live like that. What she needed wasn't warmth. It was delay. If the shelter could slow heat loss enough, even a small fire could hold the interior above freezing. If the wind could be forced to move around the structure instead of through it, the stove wouldn't have to fight constantly. That was why the curved metal mattered. Steel didn't insulate. Everyone knew that, but steel could block wind completely, and the Quonset shape gave it no place to catch. Gusts slid over the curve and lifted away. No pressure points, no corners for the air to tear at. The gaps worried people the most. "You've left cracks," one man told her, pointing at the uneven seams between panels. "Cold'll pour right through those." Martha didn't argue. She knew the difference between air leaking slowly and air rushing freely. Perfect sealing wasn't possible with scrap. Control was. Inside the shelter, she planned for stillness. The metal shell would take the wind. The interior space would trap calm air. Movement would be slowed enough that the stove had a chance. Fuel was the other threat. Out there, every stick of wood mattered. She cut deadfall along the creek and hauled it by hand. Wet wood smoked and burned poorly. Dry wood was precious. She couldn't afford to waste heat pushing back against constant drafts. The math was unforgiving. If the shelter lost heat faster than she could replace it, she'd burn through her supply before midwinter. If she burned through her supply, there was no fallback. People assumed she was gambling. They didn't understand she was calculating. She wasn't trying to be comfortable. She was trying to stay alive when the weather stopped being forgiving. By early November, the nights dropped into the low 20s. Frost lingered all day in shaded spots. Martha lit the stove inside the shelter for the first time and waited. The difference was immediate, not warmth, quiet. The wind scraped across the outside of the metal, but inside, the air barely moved. The fire didn't roar. It didn't need to. The interior warmed slowly and stayed there longer than she expected once the fire burned down. That surprised her. She tested it deliberately. Let the stove go low. Watched the thermometer she'd salvaged from the bunkhouse. The temperature dropped, but not sharply. It paused as if something was holding it back. That something was the shape and the still air it created. Still, she didn't trust it yet. Early December brought the first real test. A 2-day storm rolled through with heavy wind and blowing snow. Temperatures dipped near zero overnight. Martha fed the stove sparingly and waited for the cold to rush in. It didn't. The shelter stayed just above freezing through the worst of it. Not warm, but safe. No ice formed on the inside walls. Her breath didn't fog the air while she slept. That was enough to keep going, but it wasn't enough to relax. Everyone in Dry Creek Junction knew what December meant. It was a warning month. Real winter came after Christmas. That was when storms stacked, fuel ran short, and mistakes turned serious. People stopped telling Martha to leave. Now they told her she wouldn't last. She might get through December, someone said at the feed store. But January will finish it. Martha didn't respond. She spent her time checking seams, banking earth against the base of the shelter, stacking wood where it would stay dry. She added weight where the wind tried to lift the metal. She adjusted the stove pipe twice to improve draft. Every change was about one thing, slowing loss. Because she knew exactly what was coming. Northern Wyoming winters didn't test shelters with single storms. They tested them with persistence. Day after day of cold that didn't lift. Night after night where the fire burned down and everything depended on how slowly heat escaped. And Martha Harlan had built her shelter for that moment, not to impress anyone, not to look right, but to survive when winter stopped giving warnings and started collecting mistakes. Martha Harlan didn't think of what she was building as a shelter at first. Shelter implied something temporary, something meant to be endured until better conditions arrived. What she needed was something that could hold its ground when conditions only got worse. She worked with what the land and circumstance allowed. The abandoned work camp up the valley had been picked over for years, but it still held what others had ignored. Curved Quonset panels bent out of shape, steel ribs with rust flaking along the edges, bolts mismatched and stripped, lumber warped enough that no one wanted it for a proper build. None of it was ideal, all of it was usable. Martha hauled the pieces one load at a time, dragging what she couldn't lift, bracing what she couldn't straighten. She laid the curved ribs first, setting them low and anchoring them into shallow trenches she dug by hand. Instead of raising the structure high, she kept it close to the ground, letting the earth shoulder part of the load. Height invited wind. Low shapes survived it. She oriented the half Quonset so its open side faced away from the prevailing winter gusts. The curved back took the brunt of the weather, forcing air to rise and slide instead of slamming straight in. It wasn't airtight. It didn't need to be. It needed to be controlled. Neighbors who stopped by pointed out the flaws immediately. You've got gaps all along the seams. That metal's thin. You can see daylight in spots. Martha nodded and kept working. She wasn't building a sealed box. She was building layers of resistance. The first layer was the shape itself. Wind hit the curve and lost focus. Instead of creating pressure against a flat wall, it flowed over and away. That alone reduced how aggressively the cold could strip heat. The second layer was mass. She piled earth and stone along the base of the metal shell, tamping it tight wherever she could. Not enough to bury the structure, just enough to add weight and stability. That earth didn't insulate in the way people imagined insulation did. It moderated temperature. It kept the metal from matching the worst extremes of the air outside. Metal exposed to open wind could drop to ambient temperature quickly. Metal backed by earth cooled far more slowly. That mattered at night. Inside the shell, Martha didn't rush to finish the interior. She spent days simply sitting inside during different weather, feeling how air moved, how sound changed, how the space behaved once the wind picked up. She noticed something important. Even with gaps in the metal, the interior air stayed relatively calm as long as there was no straight path through. Air entered slowly, filtered by the curve and the irregular seams. There were no drafts rushing across the floor. No cold jets cutting through the space. Still air lingered. That was the third layer. Martha built the living space smaller than the shell itself, framing a rough inner wall from salvaged boards and leaving a gap between the metal and the interior. Not a uniform gap, not measured precisely, but enough to create a buffer zone where air could sit quietly. That space did more than any amount of insulation she'd ever seen. The metal shell absorbed the initial shock of cold and wind. The air gap slowed whatever made it through. By the time the cold reached the inner wall, it had lost most of its force. She placed the stove near the center of the interior space, not against the wall. Heat didn't need to be pushed outward aggressively. It needed to be allowed to settle. The stove pipe was another compromise. The salvaged sections didn't fit cleanly, so she overlapped them carefully and sealed joints with clay and ash, checking draft constantly. A blocked flue in winter could kill as easily as cold itself. Ventilation worried her more than the cold. Too little air exchange and moisture would build. Too much and she'd lose the stillness she depended on. She left small openings high and low, not aligned, so air had to meander rather than rush. The effect was subtle but steady. Moist air escaped slowly. Fresh air entered just enough to keep the space livable. When the first snowstorms came in November, Martha paid close attention. Snow drifted around the shelter but didn't pile heavily against the curve. Wind scoured some areas bare and left others buried. The metal shed snow unevenly but never dangerously. She added weight where she saw lift beginning and adjusted where necessary. This wasn't a build you finished and walked away from. It was a build you listened to. Inside, the shelter behaved differently from any space she'd lived in before. Sound softened. The roar of wind became a distant scrape. The temperature didn't spike when the stove burned hot, but it didn't collapse when it burned low either. That difference mattered more than warmth. She tested it intentionally. On a cold November night, she let the fire die down and went to sleep without feeding it again. In her old bunkhouse, that would have meant waking to ice on the walls. Here, she woke to cold, but not freezing. The thermometer hovered just above the danger line. She smiled at that, not because it was comfortable, because it meant she had time to wake up, time to feed the stove, time to fix a problem before it became fatal. The shelter wasn't warm, it was forgiving. That forgiveness was what people misunderstood when they mocked the build. They assumed survival meant holding high temperatures. It didn't. It meant slowing change enough that mistakes weren't immediately punished. Martha reinforced the shelter as December deepened. She added another layer of scrap metal where the wind cut hardest. Banked more earth where the base cooled too quickly. Hung heavy canvas inside the entry to create a crude airlock. Nothing was elegant, everything was deliberate. By mid-December, the shelter had taken on a certain solidity. It didn't rattle the way it had at first. It didn't shift when the wind gusted. The interior temperature stayed within a narrow band unless she made it change. People stopped telling her what would go wrong. Now they asked how long she thought it would last. "That won't hold through January," someone said at the feed store. Martha didn't answer. She didn't know how long it would last, but she knew why it might. Because she wasn't fighting winter with strength or resources she didn't have. She was fighting it by removing its advantages. No direct wind, no rapid heat loss. No sudden collapse when the fire burned low. The shelter didn't need to win. It only needed to outlast the cold. By the time Christmas passed and the forecasts began to darken, talk of Arctic air settling in, of back-to-back storms with no thaw between, Martha felt something she hadn't felt since being forced off the ranch. A measure of control. The shelter stood low and awkward against the creek, patched together from scrap and stubbornness. It looked like nothing anyone would choose if they had options. But Martha didn't have options. She had winter coming. And for the first time since she'd been thrown out with the cold closing in, she believed she had built something that might just hold long enough to save her. Winter didn't arrive all at once. It stacked itself day by day, tightening the foothills until every mistake mattered. The first real storm came just after New Year's, rolling down from the north with heavy wind and dry snow that scoured the ground bare in some places and buried it chest-deep in others. Temperatures dropped below zero overnight and stayed there through the morning. For most people in Dry Creek Junction, it was an inconvenience. For Martha Harlan, it was a warning. She fed the stove carefully that first night and listened. The wind struck the curved metal hard, then slid away. There was noise, but it wasn't the violent rattling she'd feared. It sounded more like pressure than impact, a steady force rather than a blow. Inside the shelter, the air barely moved. She slept in short stretches, waking to check the stove and the seams. The interior temperature dipped, then stabilized just above freezing. Not warm, but safe. By morning, the storm had moved on. That was when the real test began. The second system arrived 3 days later and didn't leave. Snow fell for 2 days straight, driven by wind that never seemed to weaken. Roads disappeared. Fence lines vanished. The creek froze hard enough to hold weight. Temperatures hovered between -5 and -15 day and night. This was the kind of weather that wore people down. In town, wood piles shrank fast. Stoves ran hot. Chimneys smoked thick and constant as families tried to push back against the cold. Houses warmed briefly after stoking, then cooled again within hours. Sleep came in pieces. No one relaxed. Martha's routine barely changed. She fed the stove morning and evening. She cooked simple meals. She stayed inside unless she needed wood or had to clear snow from the base of the shelter. The interior temperature hovered just above freezing, sometimes climbing a few degrees when the fire burned strong. The important part was what didn't happen. The temperature never collapsed. The third storm arrived before the second had fully passed. Wind shifted direction and strengthened, funneling straight down the creek bed. Snow piled against the shelter in uneven drifts, packing tight along the base of the metal. Martha watched closely for trouble. She checked the seams for ice buildup. None formed. She pressed her hand against the interior wall. Cold but not biting. The air inside stayed dry enough that her breath didn't fog unless she stood still for long. On the fourth night, she let the fire burn lower than she intended. Exhaustion caught up with her and she slept through the usual wake-up time. When she opened her eyes, it was still dark. She checked the thermometer, 34 degrees. In her old bunkhouse, that would have meant ice on the walls and frozen water. Here, nothing had frozen. The temperature had dropped slowly and stopped, as if the shelter itself refused to give up any more heat without a fight. She added wood and waited. The room warmed again, not quickly, but steadily. That was the moment she knew the shelter was doing what she had hoped. Not holding warmth perfectly, but buying time. The worst stretch came in late January. A high-pressure system settled over the region and locked everything in place. The sky cleared, which made the cold sharper. Nighttime temperatures plunged below -20 and stayed there. Wind didn't gust, it pressed, constant and unforgiving. This was the weather people feared. In Dry Creek Junction, trouble followed quickly. A cabin near the edge of town lost its draft when creosote froze in the flue, filling the interior with smoke and forcing the occupants outside to clear it in the dark. Another family ran out of dry wood and burned green timber that produced more smoke than heat. Martha stayed inside. She fed the stove sparingly and watched the numbers. The interior temperature stayed between 32 and 38 degrees, depending on how recently she'd added fuel. Never comfortable, always survivable. On the third night of that stretch, the wind rose further, shrieking through the cottonwoods and scraping the metal shell hard enough to vibrate. Martha sat on her bunk and listened, waiting for something to fail. Nothing did. The curved panels flexed slightly and settled back. The weighted base held. Snow packed tighter against the earth she'd banked, adding insulation instead of pressure. The shelter didn't fight the storm. It absorbed it. By the fifth day of sustained cold, the storm had taken its toll across the valley. People looked hollow-eyed at the feed store. Conversations centered on fuel and exhaustion. Someone mentioned Martha. "Anyone seen her lately?" Another man shrugged. "If she's still out there, I don't know how." That afternoon, Edgar Boone, who hauled supplies when roads allowed, snowshoed up the creek to check on her. He didn't expect much. He brought extra blankets prepared for the worst. Martha opened the shelter door when he knocked. She looked tired, cold but upright. "You alive?" he asked, trying to sound light. "I'm here," she said. "Come in if you want." Edgar ducked inside and stopped short. The air wasn't warm, but it wasn't brutal either. He took off his gloves slowly, flexing his fingers. "What's it at?" he asked. Martha pointed to the thermometer, 36 degrees. Edgar blinked. "It's -22 outside." He walked the interior, touching walls, looking at the seams. No ice. No dripping, no smell of damp metal. He crouched near the floor where cold usually pooled. It was cold but steady. "How much would you burning?" he asked. Martha told him. Edgar whistled quietly. "That shouldn't be possible," he said. She didn't argue. By early February, the worst had passed. The temperature rose slightly, climbing back toward zero. Snow stopped falling. The wind eased. Martha stepped outside and looked over the shelter. The metal was scuffed and iced in places. Snow had piled high against one side and scoured the other bare. The structure looked exactly like what it was, a patchwork of scrap forced to endure more than anyone thought it could. Inside, nothing had frozen, not once. Her water stayed liquid. Her stove never failed. The shelter never collapsed. She never woke to panic or desperation. She had been cold. But she had been safe. Word spread without embellishment. People compared notes, who had burned how much fuel, who had frozen pipes, who had nearly lost draft, and who hadn't. Martha's name came up again and again, not as a curiosity, as a fact. When winter finally loosened its grip enough for people to breathe again, the question wasn't whether the scrap-built Quonset shelter had worked. The question was how close everyone else had come to failing, because winter hadn't tested Martha's shelter with a single storm. It had tested it with time. And time had been the one thing she couldn't afford to lose. The shelter had given it back to her, hour by hour, night by night, until spring was no longer a hope but an inevitability. That was what saved her. When February edged toward March and the cold finally began to loosen, it did so without apology. Snow stayed deep. Nights still dropped hard, but the worst had passed and everyone in Dry Creek Junction knew it. Survival was no longer in question. What lingered was comparison. People didn't gather to praise Martha Harlan. No one admitted they'd been wrong. Instead, they asked practical questions in low voices, usually when no one else was listening. How did you keep it from icing up? Did the metal sweat inside? How much wood did you burn? Martha answered the same way she'd answered all winter, without pride and without explanation that wasn't necessary. She showed them the curve of the panels, the earth banked tight against the base, the gap that let air sit still instead of racing through. She explained what mattered and left the rest alone. By early spring, changes began. One man enclosed the windward side of his cabin with scrap tin and lumber, creating a crude buffer space. Another stacked cordwood against his north wall, leaving an air gap between the pile and the cabin itself. A third scavenged panels from the same abandoned work camp and built a low shed around his existing structure. None of them copied Martha exactly. They didn't need to. They copied the idea, stopped giving winter a straight shot at the living space. Fuel use dropped noticeably the following year. Chimneys smoked less. People slept longer. Fires were tended because they needed to be, not because panic demanded it. Martha never became a local expert. She didn't lecture. She didn't instruct. She answered questions when asked and returned to the work of living. By the time spring runoff swelled Dry Creek and softened the ground, the shelter had proven itself beyond argument. The scrap steel hadn't rotted. The seams stayed dry. The interior smelled the same as it had in November: cold metal, wood smoke, and earth. Eventually, circumstances changed. Late that summer, a rancher upriver offered Martha steady work and a place to stay through the winter. She accepted, not because she had to, but because she could choose. Before she left, she secured the shelter one last time, banking earth where it had settled and checking the stove pipe. She left it as she'd built it, low, quiet, and ready. The shelter stood empty through the following winter. It didn't collapse, it didn't fill with ice. When someone opened it the next spring, the thermometer still hung on the wall and the interior was cold, but intact. That detail mattered, because what Martha had built wasn't a fluke of desperation. It was a solution born from necessity and proven under pressure. The winter of 1958-59 had taken no pity on anyone. It had punished weakness and rewarded designs that didn't waste energy fighting the wrong battles. Martha Harlan had survived not because she was stronger or luckier than anyone else. She survived because she understood something most people learned too late. Winter doesn't care how hard you work. It only cares how fast your shelter loses heat. By blocking wind, shaping the structure to shed force, and creating still air where warmth could linger, she turned scrap into safety. She didn't need comfort. She needed time. And time was exactly what her Quonset shelter gave her. Somewhere in northern Wyoming, when snow piles deep along Dry Creek and the wind cuts across the foothills, there's a low metal structure most people would overlook. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look impressive. But it stands as proof of a simple truth the frontier has always respected. The solutions that save lives rarely look right at first. They just work when everything else stops.